Good morning to everyone. Welcome to Forum. Are you all super jazzed about daylight savings like me? Is that why we're so chatterboxy? Can you hear me? Faculty can. Britton, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, sir. All right. So, welcome to Forum today. My name is Marathana Prothro. I am the Director of General Education here at Bluffton University. This is just our regular reminder that this is an opportunity for us to listen to unique perspectives. Today's Forum presentation is among those that we are going through this semester celebrating Anabaptism at 500. Our person today who will be introducing our speaker is Micah Dodson. He is in the Peace Club. He also serves as Bluffton University's representative to the Mennonite Central Committee Great Lakes Board of Directors. So, welcome Micah Dodson.
Good morning. For today's forum, I'll be introducing Eric Kurtz. Eric got his Bachelor's of Art in English at Goshen College. Following that, his Master's of Science in Land Resources at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Following his education, Eric was the Elkhart County, Indiana Stormwater Manager for the Soil and Conservation District. Following that career path, Eric documented land use for land right claims in rural northern Argentina. Currently, Eric Kurtz is the Executive Director of the Mennonite Central Committee, Great Lakes. As a student representative on that board through Bluffton, I've gotten to know Eric Kurtz. Reflecting back, Eric is highly skilled in teamwork and collaboration with many different people. For example, Eric is approachable and always open to new ideas, never leaving anyone out. As a student representative, I'm not afraid to voice my own opinions and ideas in board meetings. It is clear to me that Eric is committed to do the right thing and seek out the truth through his work. Now I would like to welcome Eric Kurtz up to stage. Let's welcome him.
Thank you so much, Micah. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I just want to ask, has anybody here participated in the Cross-Cultural to Appalachia? Can I see a show of hands? A few. Anybody planning on doing that this year? Okay, I see you're being pointed out by your professors. So, MCC, the organization I work for, works in 45 countries around the world. We're mostly known for our international work, but we do work in the U.S. as well. And one of the programs that we run is the Appalachia program. And that has been a wonderful partnership with Bluffton University for many years to have students come and participate there in the housing construction program that we have. I'll talk a little bit about another part of that work a little later on. But let me just start by saying and acknowledging that we live in challenging times. We see a rise of nationalism and authoritarian governments. There are concerns about conflict in Eastern Europe with Ukraine and Russia as central players. We're still feeling the effects of a global pandemic. And in the US, after a period where the arc of the moral universe appeared to be moving toward racial justice, we see a resurgence of overt racism and white supremacy. Am I talking about 2025? Yes, but some of these same conditions were true in 1920 as well, the year that Mennonite Central Committee formed. Although the First World War had just ended, a rising Soviet Union was vying for territory and power. A global flu pandemic had just ended. And the promise of emancipation and reconstruction in the US had been met by a backlash of racial segregation and violence. In that year, Anabaptists in present-day Ukraine reached out to Mennonites in the US for help. They were suffering from famine, epidemics, and civil war. In response, North American Mennonites sent tractors, agricultural experts, and food. For 2 years, these groups supported 140 soup kitchens that fed almost 25,000 people a day. The picture on the left is one of those soup kitchens in 1920, and the picture on the right, unfortunately, is present-day Ukraine, where we are still doing the same thing, where people have been displaced by conflict. This was the start of MCC. MCC has been part of the Anabaptist story for just over 100 of the 500 years of Anabaptism that you are hearing about and we are celebrating this year. Yet I would argue that for many people in the Anabaptist world, MCC embodies what it means to be Anabaptist. I grew up Mennonite, and in fact, I've been part of MCC since I was 3 months old when my parents took me to the tiny country of Eswatini, this little country down in southern Africa. If you can, it's not showing up, but it's a little tiny country just to the right of South Africa. And I grew up with certain assumptions about what it means to be Mennonite or Anabaptist. Those things, some of those things were that we believe in peace and nonviolence. We believe in service, serving others, in community, and in simple living. The kitchen I grew up in had a very well used and well loved More with Less cookbook in it. Some of you have heard of that. I learned that being Anabaptist meant following Jesus and taking his words seriously. For example, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about Judgment Day and separating the sheep from the goats. Here is Eugene Peterson's translation in the Message of part of that. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort the people out, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting sheep to his right and goats to his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Enter, you who are blessed. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It has been ready for you since the world's foundation. And here is why. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you gave me a room. I was shivering, and you gave me clothes. I was sick, and you stopped to visit. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then those sheep are going to say, "Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you?" Then the king will say, "I'm telling you the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me." And I like that translation because many translations of this verse talk about when you did this to the least of these. And I like this language of overlooked and ignored better that Eugene Peterson uses. I grew up believing that this is what it meant was to follow Jesus, caring for the physical needs of others, and MCC was the place that did it best. I've since learned that from the beginning there were many ways to be Anabaptist. My particular white, Swiss-German, liberal perspective is not the only way. Imagine that. The largest groups of Anabaptists today come from places like Ethiopia, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I've come to appreciate that Anabaptism isn't the only way to follow Jesus. I've also learned that, well, MCC isn't perfect. In a spirit of humility and learning, I want to tell some stories from MCC's past that offer reassurances, warnings, and I hope, ideas for how we respond to the challenges we face today. And first, a story from outside the Anabaptist tradition that has had a profound impact on me and how I serve and follow Jesus. About 25 years ago, I had the opportunity to hear Bishop Samuel Ruiz. Bishop Ruiz served for 40 years in Chiapas, southern Mexico, among overlooked and ignored indigenous communities. In the mid-1990s, he was instrumental in peace talks between the government and Zapatista rebels who were protesting the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and a global economic system that left them behind. I still remember him telling the story of how well-meaning development organizations, he didn't name MCC, but he could have, had evolved in their thinking over the years. In his telling, the first instinct was to give the hungry food directly, like in Matthew 25. Then, Ruiz said, in the 1970s, organizations realized that people were still hungry and poor. They latched onto a saying. You may have heard it a different way, but he said it this way: give Pedro a fish, and he'll eat for a day. Teach Pedro to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime. Aha, they said, that's the key. We can't just feed people. We have to teach them skills. We need education, agricultural programs, vocational training. But in Bishop Ruiz's telling, there was still something missing. So now Pedro knows how to fish, he said, but he goes to the river and the fish have all died because someone upstream polluted it. Or he goes to his favorite fishing hole until one day there's a fence across the path, and a sign that says, private property, no trespassing. Pedro knows how to fish, but he's still hungry. This story reflects MCC's evolution in relief development and peace building. In 1920, our relief efforts were a lot about giving Pedro a fish, and that's still a big part of our work. When people are displaced by a hurricane, by war, or other disaster, they need emergency food, shelter, water, medicine. And we also engage in the work of teaching Pedro to fish. We have education programs, sanitation and hygiene, conflict resolution. But if we are not dealing with root causes, then we're just running around with Band-Aids instead of addressing the things that caused the wounds in the first place. So I want to focus on several areas where MCC is trying to address root causes. One is migration. According to the UN High Commission for Refugees, there are over 120 million people in the world who have been forced to flee from their homes. This number has grown alarmingly in the last decade, especially, as you can see on this graph. And today, about 1 in every 70 people in the world is a displaced person. Statistics, of course, don't tell what it's like for real people. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the Democratic Republic of Congo and heard stories about people displaced in camps like this one. And stories from people like Stephanie. She lost her husband and child and fled from her home when armed fighters attacked her village. You can see the trauma in her eyes. The church in eastern Congo, supported by MCC, has provided food and shelter, as well as psychological support to help her heal. Unfortunately today, anti-migrant sentiment is on the rise. We heard this in the last US presidential election, with lies about immigrants not far from here in Springfield, Ohio, and lies that are so disgusting that I will not dignify them by repeating them. And it's not just in the US. There is increasing support for nationalist parties with anti-migrant platforms in countries like Germany, Hungary, France, the UK, even in countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. On the one hand, it's normal to be fearful of something new languages, new ways of doing things. But on the other hand, as many studies have shown, newcomers usually contribute a lot more than they take away from a community. And as Christians, there is a biblical call to welcome the stranger. From the Old Testament, in Leviticus 19:34, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And even to the New Testament, where Jesus himself, in his first year of life, was a refugee when his family had to flee to Egypt because of the threat of violence. We visited some people in Congo. So the person on the second from the left here is Mama Jandri, and she lives in this modest home with her husband and 6 children. And a couple years previously, she invited Bati, who is the woman next to her, and her 6 children to live in her home. Bati was a complete stranger. Jandri says she just saw her on the street and knew she needed a place to live. And we asked her, why did you do this? She said very simply, well, no one knows the future. Someday I might need someone to take me in. Working with migrants forces us to ask the question, why are people migrating? The main drivers of forced migration are disasters, increasing due to climate change, violence and conflict, and economic conditions. We hear over and over from our partners that people want to stay home. They will return home if there is peace, stability, and a way to feed their family. As the Somali poet Warsan Shire writes, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. Part of MCC's work is to prevent migration by helping people make a living in their homes. In Chiapas, Mexico, back to where Bishop Ruiz worked, we support a cooperative that roasts and markets their coffee under the brand name Café Justo. This allows small farmers to make a living wage so that they can support their families. If you want to do one small thing to prevent people from migrating to the U.S., you could encourage your family, church, or business to buy from places like Café Justo. I would argue that it's more cost-effective, not to mention more humane, than building walls and sending military to our southern border. In 1966, in the midst of the war in Vietnam, this is my second topic, conflict and war. MCC started a new office in Washington, D.C. C.N. Hostetter and William Snyder explained the reason for this office in a letter to President Lyndon Johnson. I'm quoting extensively. We have felt increasingly a contradiction and a paradox in our efforts, trying to help the people on the one hand, while at the same time our government was engaged in an escalating war that was devastating the countryside. The time has come when we no longer maintain with faith with the homeless, the hungry, the orphaned, and the widowed to whom we minister, unless we speak out as clearly as possible against the savage war in which our country is engaged. For some Anabaptists, speaking to our government was and still is questioned. One part of the Anabaptist tradition says that while we don't participate in war, we also don't interfere with governments doing their thing. In my role, I get probably more pushback from our constituents about this topic than anything else: political advocacy. My response is the idea in this letter of trying to maintain faith with the people we hope to serve, the people who are overlooked and ignored, and who Matthew 25 says are the very embodiment of God in the world. I remember a story about one of our Syrian partners telling an MCC delegation, "Thank you for the food and blankets you are providing. Please also go back and tell your government to stop sending weapons. It's not helping." How can we be faithful to people we serve if we don't try and address the cause of their suffering, especially if our tax dollars are paying for it? And it's important to point out that we take these messages to government leaders from both parties in the U.S. The work is political but not partisan. And it's not just the US government. We have an office in Ottawa, Canada, and at the United Nations in New York. Some of you may have been to the MCC UN Student Seminar in New York. We're glad that Bluffton continues to send students there. Starting in the 1970s, MCC drew attention to the effects of cluster bombs in Southeast Asia, particularly the country of Laos. From 1964 to 1973, the US dropped the equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years on this country. A plane load of bombs every 8 minutes. Many of these were cluster munitions. They had little bombs inside them that you see on the ground here in front of these two MCC workers. About a third of these softball-sized bombs did not explode when they were dropped, leaving about 80 million unexploded bombs spread across the land. Still today, these are a danger for a farmer with a hoe or a child walking through a field. Weapons like landmines and cluster bombs have been widely recognized as inhumane because they kill and maim civilians long after fighting and conflict has ended. Princess Diana famously took up this cause in the 1990s. MCC's work brought attention to this legacy, particularly the cluster bombs, and led to investment in removing unexploded cluster bombs, as well as several international agreements. There is still work to do, because while there is a reduction in the use of these bombs are still used. A third area of addressing root causes is in climate change. Places like Zimbabwe are facing droughts like they've never seen. Coastal and low-lying areas in places like Bangladesh and Louisiana have more frequent and more severe storms and flooding. In East Africa, the range of mosquitoes carrying malaria continues to expand with a warming climate. And we can't talk about climate change without pointing out that we in the United States produce 15% of the world's carbon emissions, while we have just 4% of the world's population. Meanwhile, the people suffering the effects are almost always people who are already marginalized and who are contributing very little in terms of carbon emissions. At the same time, I found out this story gets more complex. When I visited the Congo, I found that our pursuit of clean energy solutions can also cause suffering. The wealth of minerals in the DR Congo, valued at over $24 trillion, should be a blessing to the country, but has really been a curse to people living in local communities, because minerals like copper, cobalt, and lithium, which are in high demand for laptops, cell phones, and electric car batteries, the wealth from these minerals is mostly going to outside countries and companies. Over 7 million people in eastern Congo have been displaced, with most of those due to armed clashes over minerals. We absolutely have to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, but we also have to ask who's benefiting from the mining of the minerals. A fourth area is in racial justice. Last week, I was privileged to be part of a conference recognizing the 30th anniversary of the Damascus Road Anti-Racism Training Program. This program, which started within MCC but has since spun off as a new program called Roots of Justice, challenged a mostly white Mennonite church in the US to recognize and dismantle its own racism. I bring this up with trepidation because white folks like me within MCC and the church weren't always good at hearing hard truths about racism, and we continue to need to learn. However imperfectly, MCC still has a commitment to dismantling racism. 4 years ago, we got an opportunity to live into that commitment when we found out that property we owned in West Virginia had been the site of the Henrietta Dismukes Hospital, one of the premier black hospitals in the country at that time. I'm going to show a video that tells more of the story, but we made a commitment that we are going to tell this story. And those of you who visit Appalachia, I hope you have more of a chance to hear about this more.
So this is the site of the Henrietta Dismukes Hospital and Nurses Home. It was opened from 1929 to 1932, and its head physician was Dr. Henry Dodford Dismukes. Henrietta Dismukes Hospital was recorded to be the largest privately owned black hospital in the country in the early 1930s.
We didn't know that it was the home for nurses. We didn't know what that was. We knew that it was a hospital, though. That building that burned down, we knew that that was a hospital, but we didn't know the significance of the hospital.
Dr. Stevens of Bluefield Sanitarium came to him saying, we have a lot of contract with coal companies and we don't want to treat the black coal miners. Would you take on this position of taking the black coal miners in the area, and we would pay you for it? They enter in this contract, Dr. Dismukes with Bluefield Sanitarium. So throughout the next few years, he is working under this contract, but he is not getting paid adequately by Bluefield Sanitarium. So in 1931, he takes Bluefield Sanitarium to court for breach of contract. This makes him the first black man to take a white corporation to court in U.S. history. This has been a lost story for 100+ years, and we're finally bringing it to light.
In a way, it makes you angry, you know. It kind of ticks you off to think that this was our history that we didn't know nothing about, you know, and why not, you know.
African American history, black history is very prevalent here. Through finding the history of Dr. Dismukes, MCC realized that there are many, many stories within Central Appalachia and all over that have been overlooked, especially black voices, black histories. And once a month, the first Tuesday of the month, the community comes together and hears a voice from the community.
And once the stories started coming out, it's almost like when you turn the pages in a book. That's what these stories are like.
Showcasing black history is extremely important to bring to light these stories of injustice, such as Dr. Dismukes.
So it seems that every time you have a lost story, you find lost history. And once you find the lost history, it makes you know that you're a lot richer than where you started out to be.
So that scratches the surface of that story, but we are committed to bring to light some of the lost stories, as mentioned, of that community, which has been and continues to be a thriving black community in Appalachia. Also, I wanted to point out Vivian Anderson, the community member who was interviewed in that video. When I first met her, she came up to me and said, "I'm a Mennonite." And it turns out that she attended a Mennonite Brethren church in North Carolina for a while when she was living there. There's not a Mennonite church in Kimball, West Virginia, so she's attending somewhere else. But she was proud of that heritage and connected with MCC at that level. It's a great reminder that we knew some people in common, and it was a good reminder of the broad range of the Anabaptist community. So these, again, are discouraging times and uncertain times. Where do we find hope when we're addressing big issues like climate change, migration, racism, and armed conflict? The celebration of Damascus Road that I referenced a few minutes ago was a surprisingly hopeful event, considering the current challenges to racial justice. In her plenary talk, Dr. Regina Shan Stolzfus one of the people who started Damascus Road, acknowledged the rise of overt expressions of racism that we have seen since last fall's elections. This includes things like in Goshen, Indiana, there were KKK flyers distributed in a neighborhood with calling for immigrants to self-deport. And there have been white supremacists displaying swastikas on an overpass in Cincinnati. But Dr. Shan Stolzfus kept coming back to this mantra. We've been here before. We've been here before. Racism is nothing new in this country, and some of the other challenges we're facing as well. In fact, Tulani Moore, another person who's been involved with Damascus Road since the early days, took it a step further. He said, our greatest tool is hope. That's why the system weaponizes despair. Our greatest tool is hope. Several speakers said that every time there's progress toward racial justice, there is a backlash. Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, the first black president, the movement for black lives. The backlash shows that people who think they benefit from the status quo are scared. Another one of our partners, I haven't mentioned Palestine and Gaza, but we have been in that area for over 75 years. And our partner there, Kairos Palestine, says this about hope. Hope is the capacity to see God in the midst of trouble and to be co-workers with the Holy Spirit who is dwelling in us. Hope means not giving in to evil, but rather standing up to it and continuing to resist it. I take this to mean that hope is action-oriented. Hope is the recognition of agency, the idea that we can respond faithfully even if the odds seem against us. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. We don't have to be optimistic to be hopeful. And let me just say, if our partners working in Gaza right now can have hope, then you and I can have hope. So have hope. Take action. You don't have to do everything. Just choose one way to embody God's love. Stand up for people who are marginalized, overlooked, or ignored, even when it's not popular. And I would be remiss if I failed to tell you that one option for taking action is through MCC. We have one-year positions through a program called SALT, Serving and Learning Together. These are not just a way to put your faith into action, but these are experiences that look good on a resume. Whatever you do, don't fall prey to cynicism, even today. God knows we've been here before. And I will end with a non-traditional blessing from Benedictine sister Ruth Fox. May God bless you with a restless discomfort about easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may seek truth boldly and love deep within your heart. May God bless you with holy anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work tirelessly for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with the gift of tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, and starvation, so that you may reach out to bring comfort and transform their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you really can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, with God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. Amen.
So now take a couple of minutes and chat with a neighbor, maybe reflections on the parallels that Eric spoke about, or perhaps questions you have regarding Mennonite Central Committee or MCC's work here in the U.S. today. We'll open it up for questions in just a couple of minutes.
Eric, you mentioned at the end that there's opportunities for recent college graduates to participate in SALT. Can you mention like what are some of the locations that students might have options for going to as part of that program?
Sure. Thank you for the softball call. That's a great one. I mean, obviously, I've got the website up there. Go and find it. But some of the different opportunities, and I should say, if you're graduating this year and you are interested, you should get on it now, because now is when we're making placements. But it's also, it's a great, I mean, some people do this as a gap year. It's anybody from age 18 to 30 is eligible. Different places would be like Kenya, Cambodia. There are positions in like the West Bank and Palestine. There would be a number in Latin America, places like Bolivia, Guatemala. And there would be a range of different options. Some posts in things like communications, writing, maybe social media for one of our partner organizations. Often people get placed with a partner, a local organization that you get to work with. You might have positions in engineering, water resources, health and sanitation, those kind of things. So, yeah, look on the website. There's lots of more ideas there. Was anybody here at the UN seminar? Anybody here? One in the back, okay. Good, so that's another point of connection with MCC.
I'll just make a comment on the Dismukes project. Last summer, I had the privilege of working at Appalachia Build over there, but I feel like it's important to look back at the history, especially with oppression, because I feel like there's a lot of forgotten stories. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, Micah.
I will second Micah's comment. We spent a week, the Bluffton group spent a week in Kimball last year and heard that story. And I'll also mention, since I don't think any of those students are here today, that story had a pretty profound impact on them. It was a very meaningful story. It was one of the things that they chose to include in their forum presentation about the experience that we had in Kentucky and West Virginia. And I'll also make one more comment that I know I've said to you before, Eric, but for, I guess, primarily the benefit of the students who are currently planning to go to Kentucky, that you talked about the resource extraction that happens in Congo, that mining, and that is a theme that we bring up frequently about what has happened and continues to happen in Appalachia with the coal mining industry, extracting coal and mineral wealth from the area and then not reinvesting in the area. So as a result, so much money has flowed out of that area, and there's a lot of need that's left behind that does not get serviced by all that wealth.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. That's a really, really important thing to say, and these connections between what happens in a place like Appalachia and DR Congo and Bolivia and Oak Flat, if you're aware of that situation, it's really important to be aware of those.
Let's thank our speaker one more time, and you are dismissed.